Hi, everybody. And yeah, we're lucky that it's only raining tonight a little bit, and it was such a warm day. And so I'm glad to see people in person here as always, but thanks also to the folks at Zoom who are joining us. And we always record these programs and then we have them available at our museum website. After they're recorded, we put closed captions and then we have them on our YouTube site. So let me just do a little introduction using my slides while people are getting organized.
I just have to brush my teeth, boo, and then we can play.
There we
I
go.
take back my not playing with you, Lady Bear. If you want to play, we'll play.
Someone has their audio on. Okay. All right. So this program tonight is part of an ongoing lecture series that relates to our current exhibit, which I happen to have brought our gallery guide, which just describes the exhibit. If you're interested, you can pick one of those up. The current exhibit is called A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity. And we're showcasing some really interesting history that we've uncovered about Birmingham that relates to a lot more diversity than most people think goes with Birmingham's story. So we encourage you to stop by the museum. And tonight's program, of course, is also in honor of Black History Month. We have been able to identify quite a lot of Black history in our area, and we have been doing quite a bit of research with that. We have a lot of content on our website about it. And we like to say, you know, Black history is not just February, you know, especially in this area, Black history is all the time. So check us out. Part of how this presentation tonight came about is because of some recent Black history. And I just want to touch on that. Those of you who aren't already aware, we last year were able to nominate the grave sites of Elijah Fish and George Taylor at Greenwood Cemetery in Birmingham because of the connection of those two men to the Underground Railroad, which we were able to establish and document and send to the National Park Service. And in return, they gave us this certificate, and we are now listed on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom for Birmingham. Another outgrowth of some of this research, and that relates to some of the material that I'm going to be talking about tonight also, is that the the Birmingham Museum with 4 other communities, historical organizations, is now part of a 5-part project called, it's, my goodness, I don't have the actual title of the project, but it's to research the Underground Railroad in South Oakland County, both parts of the picture, which includes abolitionists as well as freedom seekers. And this pilot project involves Birmingham, Farmington, Pontiac, Royal Oak, and Southfield. And any discussion about Black history, the African-American story in our country, and many other diversity issues, it's important to call attention to language and the importance of changing our language. And so this slide is just as a reminder, if you haven't been exposed to this, I want to make sure and underscore, there are really great reasons why we don't say slave or former slave anymore. We describe the people as enslaved people. Freedom seekers is the preferred term rather than fugitive slave. And we even see self-emancipated as a phrase, which is used instead of escaped slave, and enslaver rather than owner and slaveholder. And why? Well, because the old language is dehumanizing, and it actually perpetuates the sense that people who were enslaved were somehow in a status that was a permanent status that never changed. So if you were a slave, then you were a former slave, and that went with you, and it was part of your identity. And actually, the status of being in that situation was forced on people. So it was something that happened to them. So the change in language helps reinforce that change. as we're looking at some of the emerging research, especially in Michigan and in Oakland County, we want to emphasize that there are two sides of this story. In any story about the Underground Railroad, there are the public, political, or what sometimes people just assume are the abolitionist side of the story. And the other side is the freedom seeker. And in researching this material, it's often much easier to identify abolitionists. Why? Because, well, they were probably writing, they were publishing articles, they were gathering for meetings, they were putting announcements in newspapers, and we can find all those documents pretty well. If they were passionate about the anti-slavery movement, they were often community organizers. We can find these people's names in all kinds of activities that reinforce what they were doing. The private or the personal side also includes people who were abolitionist leaning, but who had lots of good reasons to keep that more private, keep it more personal. Certainly freedom seekers were not announcing their status as freedom seekers, because the whole point was to get freedom in Canada. And to do that, you needed to remain, under low profile. Sometimes people who were sheltering freedom seekers also wanted to keep that profile low for obvious reasons. If you believe in the abolitionist movement and you want to see policy change, that's a very public position. But if you're actually sheltering people on your farmstead who are trying to get to Canada, you might not want that known publicly. Also, churches were heavily involved on both sides of this story. And so often church organizations will have connections to activities that helped freedom seekers and were a lot more private and personal, or might have been a personal belief system held by people who were aiding freedom seekers. What happened in Michigan that helps explain the position that Oakland County was in really involves some of the federal legal wrangling that was going on. So on the left side of the screen, there were a lot of Underground Railroad events happening in Michigan before 1850. The Michigan as a territory was a wilderness in the early 19th century, and Michigan didn't even become a state until 1837. And we know that people became freedom seekers before and around that time. But for many of them, simply getting to the Michigan border was all that was needed to achieve freedom. So in the very early period, sometimes people would just simply cross the border in Michigan. And the area in Cass County called Cassopolis is a really good example. There was a large community of freedom seekers who settled there and began to farm and so forth in the early part of the 19th century. But what began to happen is that pressure on those freedom seekers in Michigan and the people in the communities nearby began to build, because it became more and more common for bounty hunters to come all the way from some of the southern states into Michigan looking for people who had escaped enslavement. And they could often locate those people once they crossed the border to Michigan. And toward the end of the 1840s, there began to be a lot of activity where some of these people would raid abolitionist farms. They would arrest or take into captivity people who were African American, whether they had proof or not of their status. And so there were a lot of court challenges. And in Michigan, those court challenges in the late 1840s, and also on the Indiana side of the Michigan border, just kept the pressure up until finally the Congress had to act. And the way they acted was so punitive that they created the Fugitive Slave Bill. And the Fugitive Slave Bill is a thing that turned everything on its head. Because in 1850, now, if you lived in Michigan and you aided someone who was trying to seek freedom, you were now committing a crime. Before 1850, that wasn't the case. And so after the bill passed, there were a lot of abolitionists who became even more devoted to their belief system. And people in Michigan that might have been neutral or, not as involved began to be galvanized, because you've heard things like this before or recently. Nobody wants the federal government telling you what you can and can't do and what is and is not legal in your state. And so there were a number of the changes that came about in 1850 made it very difficult. For example, it required that all US citizens in all states, even free states, had to, by law, were required to aid the recapture of freedom seekers. That there were stiff fines, for US Marshals if they did not comply. Their job began to change to running around and gathering up people who were African American, or aiding the bounty hunters who came to the area. The Black people who were detained and arrested could not give evidence on their own behalf. All that was needed was a written affidavit from a potential enslaver who says, this person is my property, and that was all that was required for that person to be detained and then sent back to that location. So you can imagine that it was hard to stay neutral with this going on around you. And that's why a lot of activity ramped up in the Underground Railroad in Michigan. And that led a lot of people to find new ways to shelter people. It was important to be a lot more secretive, and it was important to get the people over to Canada now, because Michigan was no longer just enough to be safe. So this is a recent map that shows the streams of movement. The Underground Railroad is often thought of as a specific route. You follow this route and you turn at this tree and you go to that farm. That doesn't appear to be the case. What really happened is that there were networks of people who knew each other and helped each other move people who were seeking freedom from place to place, but that would shift and it would change depending on conditions. It might be because a road washes out, or it might be because, a farm got burned down and it's no longer available. And there was this real sort of, dynamic and flexible way of moving people and getting them through from the South up into, in our case, Michigan, and then over to Canada. So here are some of the published maps that show, some general ideas of how people were moving. In the map on the left, you can see that there's a lot of activity that takes people from the South, Kentucky in this particular situation, but also Missouri, which is off the map, up into Michigan and coming into the west end of Michigan. But if you notice, they're moving across Michigan from there to Detroit and to Port Huron to get to Canada. The map on the right is also here because it shows you a little bit about where the earliest actual railroads were built in Michigan. And if you think about Michigan at this time, it was wilderness. Yes, there were farms and farmsteads and cabins and so forth, but really, you really aren't going to be able to take people across a forested swamp. You're going to need to use some of the main routes to move people around, or at least that's where a lot of the farmsteads were located, at least at this early period. So you can see how the routes that people would have to follow are going to go along our early roads, which were also followed the early Indian routes in our area. This is a nice overlay, at least I like it. The overlay comes from a teaching materials at the Detroit Historical Society. And then I overlaid it on an 1844 map, just to give you, kind of an idea, visual again, about how people might be coming in through the Cass County area and Niles, Michigan on the west side of the state, and then moving along from Battle Creek and through Parma, Ann Arbor, up to Farmington, to Birmingham, Rochester, onto Romeo, Port Huron, and then across the river to Canada. If there was a route also that went into Detroit, but honestly, after about 1850, Detroit was so unsafe that because of the ease with which someone could simply point at someone who's African-American and say, I have a sworn affidavit, that person is property of, such and such a person. It was so easy to be picked up and detained that it was not safe to be there, even for free blacks. And so Detroit was less likely of a place to seek access to Canada. It still was used, and there's a lot of documented evidence of that. But that's why Oakland County became much more important, and that's where Birmingham fits in. And if you look at this map, which, like I said, I think it lays it out really well, you can see that if the goal was to get to the Port Huron area, the usual routes are going to somehow come through these communities. And that leads us to some of the recent research we've uncovered. Going back to the earliest part of this period I was talking about, in the late 1830s to the late 1840s, there were some hot spots based on who was an abolitionist, who was organizing, which communities had lecturers coming in, which communities had churches that were sympathetic to the anti-slavery movement. And really, it was so early that there just wasn't a lot of development yet. Most everybody was clustered in these areas. And we're talking about Birmingham, Pontiac, and the circle toward the bottom that's a little obscured there is Farmington. So those are the three places early on that we see a lot of abolitionist activity. After 1850, toward the end of the 1840s, a little bit, and definitely after 1850 and into the 1860s, when the war was going on, this is where we see abolitionist activity. And you can see how it has fanned out, still coordinated or associated with those main three places. But now there are abolitionists who are helping people in White Lake. And up in Clarkston, there are some freedom seekers who are settling there. There are people helping toward the northern end of Oakland County in the Oxford-Orion area to move on through. We see Farmington, of course, Southfield becomes a very important spot for freedom seekers to move through Royal Oak. So switching back again to what I was saying earlier, there's a very public side of the anti-slavery movement in Oakland County. And this is an example of the ways that we are learning about that. These are older announcements and publications that are calling people together to organize anti-slavery meetings. And, I would like to call your attention to one of our Birmingham folks, which is in the lightest color one that says anti-slavery meeting at the top. The three men that had organized that include Nathan Power, who was very important Quaker abolitionist in Farmington, Elijah Fish of Birmingham, and William Stone, who was also kind of in the general Birmingham, Troy area. So these people are putting ads in papers, they're organizing meetings, they're out there. And these kind of activities went on all through this period. And so I want to tell you about some prominent abolitionists, just a little bit more detail. One of the early ones was George Wisner, who lived from 1813 to 1849, unfortunately, not very long. He was active in Pontiac in the abolition movement in 1835, quite early, to 1847. So Pontiac. So why is Pontiac even showing up in this list? Well, Pontiac was the first interior settlement in the territory of Michigan, outside of Detroit, the first. And so as Pontiac is developing and people are going there in droves, we have this community of New Englanders who are pretty strongly anti-slavery in their beliefs and in their policy. And Pontiac was founded in 1818, and within just a year or two, it became the county seat for this newly forming county. And so where are you going to go to set policy? If you're an abolitionist, you're going to be in contact with Pontiac, because that's where the county is organizing its government. Well, George Wisner was the older brother of a man who came slightly after him, his younger brother, Moses Wisner. But George Wisner came to the Pontiac area. He had been an editor and was an activist in New York, even as young as being a teenager. And he was a rabble rouser, and he he started riots and fights. And so he had already had this firebrand career before he even came here. So his younger brother Moses followed him shortly thereafter, and Moses Wisner is a name well known in Pontiac. And Moses Wisner went on to become governor of Michigan. He went on to be a Civil War hero, and the Wisner site, the Wisner Mansion, Pine Grove, is a historic site that you can go visit. It's in Pontiac. So this is a little bit about George Wisner, and because these people were well known for their day, we often have portraits of them. Among his activities, George Wisner co-founded the Oakland County Anti-Slavery Society. Kind of moving a little bit forward in time, a contemporary of George Wisner's was Elijah Fish of Birmingham. And Elijah Fish lived from 1791 to 1861, but he was active in Birmingham in the abolitionist movement from the 1830s to the 1850s. Why Birmingham? Well, Pontiac was the first settlement in the interior Michigan, and Birmingham was basically the second one. It was halfway between Detroit and Pontiac, and so based on that location, it attracted a lot of settlers early on, but it also was along a very important route, the Saginaw Trail, which had been an Indian footpath early on, but became a major road. And the Saginaw Trail is what we know today as Woodward Avenue. So access to, if you're going to be organizing abolitionists and you're going to gather people together and have meetings, you have to be able to get together and go somewhere, and you have to be able to, get there. You can't just be going across forest. You have to be able to gather in Pontiac. And so that's why the transportation routes, especially early on, made a big difference. So Elijah Fish, this image of him is actually a composite of that we created from a picture of his son and his brother. So it's a rendering that we like, but I need to give you that kind of the explanation that it's really not a photograph of him, but this is maybe what he looked like. So he co-founded the Oakland Anti-Slavery Society, and I just mentioned that George Wisner also had done that. So these were men who knew each other. He also, Elijah Fish, founded the Birmingham Presbyterian Church. He became an officer in a group that was called the Friends of Humanity, and he presided over its convention in 1851 in Detroit. He organized the Friends of Liberty in Birmingham, which was another splinter group of abolitionists to bring abolitionist lecturers to Birmingham, Michigan. In 1844 and in 1858, Birmingham was a little more settled, travel was a little easier, and national lecturers like Henry Bibb and William Cooper Nell were brought to Birmingham by Elijah Fish. And so that's another way that Birmingham made a difference in the anti-slavery movement. Fish also raised funds and donations for the Underground Railroad and the Refugee Home Society in Canada. That was a group that formed after 1850 under Henry Bibb to purchase land in Canada so that when freedom seekers arrived, they would have a way to acquire land at low rates and to be able to farm and hopefully support themselves. A little more about Elijah Fish is that his sons, Lucian and Edmund, continued with their family abolitionist belief system and activities, and they helped found the Republican Party in Michigan in 1854, which was staunchly anti-slavery. And then they went on to Kansas. And if you know kind of what the flow of events was at that time, Kansas was a territory that everybody was fighting to have control over, whether it would be a slavery state or an anti-slavery state. And so there were, all these settlers that were going to try to sway the development of the territory when it became a state to one way or the other. So his sons both ended up there, and one of them was in the legislature even. And then I'm just adding what I already said before, which is that Elijah Fish's burial site is at Greenwood Cemetery, and it was added to the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom just earlier last year. So who were these prominent abolitionist lecturers that Elijah Fish brought to Birmingham? Well, one of them was Henry Bibb, who is on the upper right. Henry Bibb had been an enslaved man who self-emancipated and then went on to become a famous lecturer and writer. He was very dedicated to the anti-slavery movement, and it was Bibb who went to Canada to try to arrange the purchase of the land so that freedom seekers would have a safe place to live once they got to Canada. Another important Black lecturer was William Cooper Nell. He was never enslaved, but he was also a very passionate and very well-known national speaker. And if you can picture Birmingham, Michigan in the 1840s and 50s, it was basically a small town, but it did have some rather large buildings. One of them was owned by a man named Roswell T. Merrill, and it was like Mechanics Hall. It was like the biggest gathering place in Birmingham. And that building was used to assemble people when these people came to town. And we know, if you're familiar with Birmingham history, you know who Martha Baldwin was. Well, Martha Baldwin went to one of these lectures. I think we discovered it. It was the lecture of William Cooper Nell in 1858, when she was a teenager, to hear this man talk about slavery, anti-slavery.
Actually, a question in the chat. Would you like me to hold it to the end or ask you now?
It's okay to ask now.
Okay. The question is, did Fish's sons have any contact with John Brown while in Kansas?
Did the Fish sons have any contact with John Brown in Kansas? I don't know the answer to that. Can't answer that at this point, but it's a great question and we should check into it. Okay, so another one to mention, he was on one of the other lists, one of the announcements that I showed you an example of from one of the papers, and that is Nathan Power. He was active as an abolitionist in the 1830s to the 1850s, but he was around a long time after that. He became involved in state politics, local politics. So Nathan Power and the Power family were part of a group of Quakers who came to settle the area in the Farmington area right now. It was a good place for them to do that because in the 1830s, it was where 3 major Indian trails crossed, and those all became major roads later. Later on, when freedom seekers were coming through Michigan, as I showed you on that map, Farmington was a stopping point on the way to Southfield, Birmingham, and beyond. So Nathan Power's activities included in 1836, he became involved in the Oakland and then later in the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society. And I just want to take a moment right here to say Oakland County's Anti-Slavery Society was formed before Michigan's. That's how important it was to the people here in Oakland County. So Nathan Power was also involved in the Refugee Home Society in Canada in 1851 and to 1853. And he was active in the political parties of the Free Soilers, which also then sort of evolved into the Whig Party, and that sort of evolved into the Republican Party. And that party was formed, you know, the first time in 1854 in, I think it was Jackson, Michigan. So Nathan Power went on to serve in the Michigan legislature, and he helped pass anti-slavery legislation in 1855. For example, I told you about the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. It didn't take states long to say, we're going to try to take control back over this. And they began to legislate internally to try to neutralize this federal. And so that is some of the legislation that Nathan Power was responsible for. There is ample evidence that he acted as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. That role would mean that people were actively helping guide freedom seekers, perhaps onto their property, help arrange transportation, and help make sure they got to the next stop. Interestingly, he also established the Farmington Historical Society way back in 1860. From what I can tell, it's one of the earliest historical societies in the nation. And under there, unfortunately, under that black bar, it says that his burial site at the Quaker Cemetery in Farmington is also on the National Park Service's Network to Freedom site. And it was named to the Network to Freedom in 2012. So it was one of the earlier sites in this area to be added. And the last man I wanted to talk about tonight with you is related to the Southfield story. The Reverend James T Milligan, who lived from 1826 to 1912, came to Southfield in 1853, and he stayed until 1873 to be the minister at what was then known as the Covenanter Church. Currently, it's called the Reformed Presbyterian Church, and it still exists. There's a photo in the lower right-hand corner that you can kind of make out, I think, that shows a picture of this little church, the small church in, I think, the 1850s. I'm sorry, 1950s, from an aerial shot. Right now, it has some additional features on it and a tower, I think, but it is still there and it's still an active congregation. So at the time, though, that Milligan came to Southfield, the Covenanter Church had been formed by the settlers in the general area of Southfield near kind of where Groves High School is, if you know where that is. You know, and then generally in the Evergreen and 13 Mile area. And so very close to Birmingham. But most of the farms there were owned by people who were members of this church and had been, the Covenanters were, basically they were their roots were in the Scotland. And they were very opposed to slavery and very active in that way. And so we see some interesting patterns after 1850, when the census was registering the activity of who was living in which households in this area of Southfield. We see a lot of African Americans in these households. And we assume that many of them were freedom seekers. Some of them may have been achieved freedom in Canada and come back to Southfield, because we know that happened. But Milligan was very central to that area being active in both sides of the picture. The church there in his story are currently looking to, there's a application in process to get them named to the National Underground Network to Freedom. So I just covered some of them were active and easier to research men that we know were connected with the abolition movement in Oakland County. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a quieter or a more secretive side. And we also have been successful in learning about people associated with this side of the story. So that is what I want to share with you right now. As I mentioned to you earlier, the movement of people through Oakland County began to increase dramatically after 1850 because Detroit had been the preferred spot up till then, but it was just not safe. And so there were a lot more people who needed to come through this area and to be moved on through to get to safety in Canada through Port Huron and also along the St. Clair River, Marine City, some of those places. You can imagine, I think, that if you are seeking to get to Canada and you have people helping you, if you don't know the area, if you're freedom seekers, they're going to get you there as discreetly as possible across the shortest water distance possible. And so the Detroit River was also another crossing point for a lot of people to get to Ontario. How people were moved. We know from reports that freedom seekers gave later in their lives when they were interviewed or wrote in their diaries or in their memoirs. They describe how they were able to get from place to place. The standard line that most of us believe or have been told is that there were secret tunnels and there were secret rooms in homes and in inns, and people would be hidden there. Well, there could have been a little of that going on, but that is not what we hear in their reports. When they tell the story of how they became free, they describe being hidden in barns, under haystacks, and a great number of them talk about being hidden in wagons with false bottoms. And the typical story is that they would move by night and they would be secreted away somewhere by day. And it just isn't logical to be in a really active place where there are a lot of people coming and going during the day when you're trying to hide and you're desperate to become free. It does make sense that you would be in outbuildings, sometimes maybe pigsties, because no one was going to be checking, in pigsties if they could avoid it. But the bottomless wagons was a thing. And the important thing, I think, is that when we hear stories about tunnels or hidden rooms, sometimes it's an oral tradition that develops because people made assumptions maybe in the late 1800s because they find an old room and in their basement and they know that there was an underground railroad and they kind of put those two things together. But it's not that easy to identify those kind of places. So we don't often know the actual physical sites unless we know that an abolitionist or someone recorded where they secreted people, and we have the documents for that. As I said, people were trying to get to Canada through Lapeer onto Port Huron and Sarnia. This is miles and miles and miles, and much of it in a combination of being on foot, but then assisted by people in wagons, hidden under, like I said, hay stacks or supplies that would be in the back of a wagon. That was another common way people were moved. And for instance, there was a man in Pontiac, Dr. Isaac Paddock, who reportedly, and we're still trying to verify this, but reportedly, because he was a doctor and he could go on rounds, that he would have his wagon in his barn. People would hide in the wagon that were freedom seekers. He would go get his horse and wagon and go to the next farm because he's making a visit as a doctor, and he would pull his wagon into the barn and people would get out and they would then hide in that barn. So that's an example of how, that could have happened. So after people went to Canada, and some of the popular places are shown in orange on this map, they often couldn't find work, or there wasn't enough work, or the economy, had a bad couple of years, or the crops failed because of bad weather. There were a lot of different reasons why things might not have worked out there. And Reverend Milligan, who I mentioned a moment ago, was known to help people come back from Canada and find work here. And that is how the freedom seeker that we have buried in Greenwood Cemetery, George Taylor, that is how he came to Birmingham. But I'll tell you a little about him in a moment. But first, I want to tell you about some freedom seekers that we found who came back and settled in Pontiac. One was the earliest one that I've been able to locate so far. We know we have documents that show he was in Pontiac as early as 1843, and that was Charles Crockett. He lived from around 1814, and he died around 1883. He was born in Delaware. He was documented in Pontiac, as I said, in 1843, and he got married in 1843. So there's a document showing that he was married here. His wife had been born in New York. It is possible that she was born into slavery in New York, even though it was less and less likely in New York. So we don't know that for sure about her. They had several children. The oldest was born in Michigan in 1847. So this is one of the ways that when we're researching, we can kind of establish a timeline of where someone was when the documents identify their location. In the 1860 census, Charles Crockett was employed as a laborer, which was pretty common for people who had been formerly enslaved, because that was the work that many of them knew how to do. And he also shows up in Pontiac in 1872 when there was a committee to celebrate the 15th Amendment in Pontiac in front of the courthouse. He was named on the committee who was working to celebrate that the 15th Amendment, which was giving everyone the right to vote, every man the right to vote. After that, Charles and his family relocated to Detroit. That's where they were in the 1880 census. And then we don't know what happened, but in 1883, he was indigent in Pontiac, and there was an announcement in the paper to raise funds for him because he had nowhere to live, to build himself a small shack of some kind. So he was homeless. And we don't know where he died or exactly when he died or where he is buried. Three other men who we know were freedom seekers who then came back to Pontiac. George Newman, who was born in 1812 or thereabouts and lived to 1900. And he was first recorded in Pontiac in 1853, after he had gone to Canada and come back. He gave his story later to a newspaper. This is how we sometimes create, reconstruct these biographies. He was born in Missouri, and he was separated from his mother at the age of 3 by his memory on the auction block. And he went into some detail in his biographical interview about this. He described being assisted via the Underground Railroad to get to Canada. He then came back to Pontiac in 1853, and he learned to read after he came back to Pontiac. He married, he had a family, he became active in the community, and then he helped found and became the minister for the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Pontiac, the oldest AME church in Pontiac. And he is buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Pontiac. Another man associated with Pontiac is William Taylor. He was born about 1812. He lived to about 1890. A little bit after that, because he shows up in some documents, but we don't know about his death at this point or where it was. Based on, again, a record that he gave, we placed him in Pontiac about 1854. He was born in Mississippi, and he actually described that his name in his enslavement was Solomon Edmonds, that he had been sold twice on the auction block, that he had a wife and 4 children before he became a freedom seeker. He escaped via the Underground Railroad while he was in Cincinnati with his enslaver in 1850. So he was accompanying his enslaver on some kind of a business trip, and he found a way to escape. And Ohio had a very active abolitionist community, so he was able to get assistance with getting north and getting to Canada. So he went to Chatham, Ontario. He then remarried there and had another child. Came back to Pontiac in 1855. He was skilled as a barber, something that he had learned early on in his life, and he wanted to buy a barber shop. And he had heard that there was one available to purchase in Pontiac, but it turned out not to be available. And so instead he went to Clarkston, and that is where he set up his barber shop. And he was a barber in Clarkston for a number of years until he went back to Ontario. And I know you can't see the bottom of the slide there, but he did, later in life, he went back to Mississippi, to where he had originally come from. And he found he tracked down his first wife. And I don't remember right now if she was still alive or if he recorded that, but he learned that one of his daughters was in Tennessee, and he went to see her. So later in life, he went back to the place where he had been enslaved to try to track these people down. And you can think about how difficult it is, for us to try to follow with modern techniques and research, to follow documents and so forth, and how difficult that must have been to try to find people after all those years. I don't know right now when he died, but he seems to have relocated back to Canada. So it's a matter of trying to find the documents there, maybe. And then the last man I want to tell you about is John Anderson. Anderson was born also around the same time. If you notice, there's a lot of these men who were born in around 1812. He was born around 1813, and they're all seeking freedom at approximately the same time as well. So John Anderson had lived until 1893. He was born in Missouri. He was sold several times. He was taken to Arkansas and Louisiana, further and further south, before he finally fled. And it's not clear the whole story, but he ended up getting to Canada via the Underground Railroad. So this is a very interesting thing about John Anderson. He finally achieves freedom in Canada, and then the Civil War begins. And what does he do? He comes back to Michigan, and he joins in the 102nd Colored Troop, which was an all African-American regiment that formed in Michigan. And he went and fought for the Union then. He ended up coming back to Pontiac. He had medical problems, and he died in 1893, and he's buried in Oak Hill Cemetery in Pontiac. So we've been able to find these people, but we know there are a lot of other ones. I'm just going to tell you about two other stories that we've known for a while. The last four men that I talked about are more recently, you know, the things that we've recently learned about. So in Royal Oak, there was a family known as the Hamers. That was the name that they gave themselves after they were self-emancipated. And they came to Royal Oak after going first to Canada, like most of these other people did. And the names that they had in Royal Oak were Gilbert or Henry Hamer, went by both, and Betty or Elizabeth Hamer. And you can see they lived to quite an older age. Elizabeth or Betty lived to 1913. They came in 1855 to Royal Oak, and they were able to find work, save money, purchase land, build a farm, and their descendants still own a portion of the property that they bought in Royal Oak. In one of the relatives still resides in that house. So they're a really interesting family, and a lot is known about them. The Royal Oak Historical Society has done a lot of work to build their whole story, including going to Kentucky and getting papers from their enslaver family. They communicated back and forth. And this is a really interesting part of their story that I'll just mention, and then I encourage you to go find out more about them. But after they came to Michigan, they were in contact through letters with their former enslavers. And the letters from their enslavers have survived, and they're in the Royal Oak Historical Society collection. But the letters from the Hamers to them have not survived. So it's very interesting that I'm summarizing, but one of the letters back basically says something to the idea of, oh, if we only knew how important it was to you to be free, we would have helped you with this before. And, you know, things of that nature that made it sound that like the family was in shock about how they had wanted to become emancipated. But they did write a couple of times, it looks like, and then later in life, they went back to the area, and their former enslaver was no longer there, but they went back to see people that they knew back in Kentucky. And then, so this is a picture showing the Hamers. This is Elizabeth with her children, and a little bit about their story is here. Just summarized it for you. And then the other key freedom seeker in our area is George Taylor, who went to Canada, came back, and began to help Reverend Milligan in Southfield, and ended up going to Kansas with him to build a new church. And so they were very close after George came back to Birmingham. And we think it's possible that the reason is because they might have known each other when George was a freedom seeker coming through Oakland County, but we have not found proof of that. It's just a hunch right now. And George got married after he settled in the Birmingham area, and he settled on one of the farms near T Milligan's church and on the Stewart farm for a while, worked, saved money, became his own, farmed his own tenant farm, and then became the first property owner in Birmingham. And that is really how we encountered his story in his obituary as part of an unexpected find from one of our volunteers. And so George and his wife Eliza, who he married here after the war, she had come to find her mother again in Royal Oak. And she had been formerly enslaved, but she was not a freedom seeker. She did not seek, to come to Michigan or anywhere during the period of her enslavement. Instead, it was after she was emancipated after the war. So this is my last slide about our content tonight. And that is when George and Eliza Taylor owned property, they bought a lot on what was then in the Bird and Stanley's subdivision. They lived on Stanley Street. They built a small house. And that's where they lived until 1901 when George died. In 1902, his wife died a few months after him. They were active in the community and they helped become and establish the newly formed United Presbyterian Church, which that's the photo of how it looked when it was founded in 1893. So that concludes my lecture for tonight. But before I close everything off, I just want to say we have one more lecture in this series. It will be next March 9th, 4 weeks from tonight. And it will be relating, like I said, back to our current exhibit, which is about diversity in Birmingham. So I'm going to be talking about the Levinsons, who were the first Jews in Birmingham. And if you look at the photo in the lower right-hand side, that's me in between two very famous members of the family, Carl Levin and Sandra Levin. So there's more to say about that family and how they came here and what they overcame. And if you're interested, please come out again in a month's time. Yes.
Is there any evidence as to why formerly enslaved people that gained their freedom over in Canada, why they were compelled to come back when they were under such threat?
Yeah, I touched on that a little bit. There were economic conditions sometimes that made it difficult to make a living successfully. And so I think a lot of times they came back to Michigan for opportunities, work opportunities, but many people did not. And there is a very large community of that relates or that is descended from some of these freedom seekers in Canada, and a very good museum there in the Buxton area that helps explain a lot better than I could about the heritage there. Yes.
Well, the ones who came back to Michigan, Canada, was it safe? Like, was it after 1855 when the state law came into effect and it was safe for them just to come out in the open?
The question is, like, did they feel safer then when they came back? Because, weren't they still at risk? Well, they were still at risk, but Detroit was a different place and a riskier place to be than Oakland County. But also, as you point out, the legislation after 1855 made it a lot easier for former freedom seekers to avoid being, recaptured and all the legal problems. So they were much more protected. And so it was easier. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate all that information. The Powell, the Powell residence in Farmington, a national site, did they manage to preserve that?
So the question is the Nathan Power site in Farmington a national site? I do not know if the house is on the National Register of Historic Places, but I think it might be on the state register, but I'm guessing. I know that a lot is known about him, and I know there's a sign out front of the house, but I just don't know what it says.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes.
The question in the chat, do we have any sense of just how many freedom seekers ended up settling in the area?
The chat question is, do we have a sense of how many people ended up? Not yet, we don't. And we may never have a great picture of that, but we are trying to track down leads. And, one of the greatest sources is the census records in 1850 and then in 1860. So during this time period, we can identify, because census takers were identifying the race of the people that they were counting most of the time. Now, it gets complicated because if somebody was biracial, sometimes they would be counted as white and sometimes they'd be counted as black. So sometimes we have to go back and forth and try to establish what, whether we can tell for sure. And there was even the designation of mulatto for a while, which was kind of a catch-all, and Native Americans were counted as mulattoes sometime. And then there are Native Americans who weren't counted because if somebody was part Native American and part African American, but they had a Native American name, they were not even considered a citizen, so they didn't get counted in the counts. You can see how it was kind of a mess, but all that being aside, we have a lot of names of people on the census, and that they have been recorded by one of our researchers and counted, but I don't know that count. So I can't answer that right now.
Thank you.
Leslie, do you know anything about other communities, not necessarily in this county, but earlier on, before all of this, I went to Adrian once to look at Laura Haviland's statue, and there was the Raisin Institute there. So I always thought that was more of a center. And then once I heard a woman speak from Jackson, who was excellent, you might know who she is. But anyway, when you showed charts, and I've seen that before in a book, I mean, they kind of don't go toward that direction. So why were those kind of centers?
So the question has to do with other parts of Michigan and such as Adrian, Jackson, and we know about Niles, we know about Cass County and Cassopolis, and how did they get involved, you know, so closely with the Underground Railroad? I think my take on it is that the answer to that is because, especially early on, when it was relatively safe for people to just get across the border of Michigan and then they could settle, there was a lot of welcoming communities there for freedom seekers who were settled down to farm. And it wasn't until 1850, which was, you know, a couple of decades into the process, before that became unsafe. So there were a lot of communities and people of color. And in fact, although the, you know, white abolitionists are the ones that are, you know, most researched early on, we're now learning that actually it was free Blacks who were most important in the Underground Railroad network in Michigan. And they were more active and more successful in general than only the white abolitionists. Although, you know, it was a partnership. Everybody was working in this direction if they were anti-slavery minded. So part of the answer to your question is all of those communities had communities of people who were opposed to slavery. And in some cases, you can go back and you can find a history that, you know, maybe there were people who settled there that they were trying to protect.
I think there was a big community of Quakers there.
Yeah. And so it kind of depends on the decade you're looking at and when the people got there and where we were at relative to the Fugitive Slave Act and what that did to people. That would be my best answer. So I guess that concludes the questions. And if you have even more questions after this, great, because that means that you can, you know, check into it some more, make sure if you do, or you find something out that you think is important, give us a call at the Birmingham Museum. We're working on this with these other communities. We have a lot of interest in it. We really want to try to help tell the whole story of the area's history. And this is part of that story. So thanks, everybody.
Yeah.